Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to the first ever public meeting of SLP developers. And we're looking forward to an opportunity to meet the people behind the scenes and talk a little bit about what's going on. I'm going to start off with some introductions, and I think I'll start with my top left, Vin Armani.
Hello.
A couple of words about what you're doing, Vin.
Okay. Well, in terms of SLP, I have contributed the Simple Ledger payment protocol, which is basically an extension of the BIP70 payment protocols, specifically to service SLP. And then more recently, the postage protocol. And have built, I'll talk a little more about both of those later. It looks like it's on the agenda.
Excellent.
And so have built both some servers and contributed to some clients for those.
Great. Thank you, Vin. Moving on to Chris Troutner.
Hey, yeah, I'm a JavaScript developer at Bitcoin.com, and I worked with Drew to help publish, and Gabriel Cardona to help publish the SLP SDK, which is a JavaScript library for working with SLP tokens. And that was back in January or February. We'll find out when we look at the timeline, but been working since then, just staying in the SLP ecosystem and helping it grow.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Next, I have James Cramer.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I'm one of the developers working on SLP. I help maintain a few of the open source SLP projects, including Electron Cash SLP edition wallet, which is written in Python, and some of the core SLP JavaScript tools and libraries. Currently, I'm working on adding the post office protocol into the Electron Cash wallet. And also I'm planning to help merge the SLP edition wallet into the main version of Electron Cash.
Great. Thank you, James.
Yep.
Next on my list, I have Mark Lundeberg.
Hi, I'm Mark Lundeberg. I'm a Bitcoin Cash developer, and with SLP, I think I was the third person involved, if I have it right. I guess we'll talk a bit about the history later. So I helped out designing SLP protocol and also developing the first SLP wallet, the Electron Cash SLP edition. And since then, I actually haven't done very much, but I'm happy to be here and talk about SLP.
All right, thank you, Mark. Drew Davis.
Hey, so I worked with James a lot in 2018 on initially designing and planning for what would turn out to be Badger Wallet, because it solved a lot of the problems that we had at the time. And also on one of the first Mint products, which we called Simple Token. And then I brought Badger Wallet into Bitcoin.com with Gabriel, and then now that's maintained along with Chris and some of the other people on our team that are great, like Pete and Paul. And I believe Badger was actually the first SLP wallet, though, Mark. I'm not sure, though. I'll take your word for it if you guys got Electron Cash out first.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Drew, and we get a chance to go over the history. As a matter of fact, that's the next thing on our agenda, is a discussion of the timeline. I'm going to ask Chris Troutner to lead us off on that.
Awesome. So yeah, when we first decided to get this panel together and we were kicking around ideas, I think future meetings will focus more on future development of the SLP protocol and things that are happening in the ecosystem. But I pitched the idea to everybody that maybe for this first meeting, we should talk about the history, because there's a lot of history. I mean, most people don't even know that Bitcoin Cash can do tokens, and those that do are sometimes blissfully ignorant of the history of its short history that's had. So we're going to just kind of walk through the last year of events and software and what happened, when they happened, and who contributed what and when, just to kind of create a base foundation that people can refer back to when we in future meetings when we talk about future development. So yeah, I just posted a link to the timeline, and it starts April 28th, 2018 is the first sort of item in this timeline. Does anybody want to chime up, and maybe we can just round robin and everybody can just talk about the line item that kind of concerned them?
Okay. So yeah, April 28th in 2018, I posted a post on RBTC proposing something called the Simple Ledger Protocol. And but at that time, it was a non-tokens version of the protocol. And if you go to that spec there, you can actually see the original specification for SLP, and you'll notice that it's drastically different from what we have today. But the original purpose was just to sort of develop a way to create any type of ledger within Bitcoin. And at that time, I was sort of new to the space, so I didn't really know anything about colored coins or the history of tokens in Bitcoin. And then after that, I quickly received feedback from the community to say, hey, you should make this like a virtual blockchain inside of Bitcoin, or like a colored coin protocol. And so then at that point, Op Group was coming up. So Op Group was a miner validated token. So it seemed silly to like develop a op return token if the miner validated token was going to be accepted. And once Op Group was rejected around June 2018, that's when I was like, okay, well, we actually have to build this tokens thing. And around that same time, and I think for the same reason, Jonald Fyookball decided to create a token as well under his own initiative because Op Group got rejected. And when he posted something, I think in Slack, I reached out to him immediately and was like, hey man, I'm working on this tokens thing also, we should join forces. And so since then we've been working together on it, and we brought Jonald found Mark Lundeberg probably on the same day that we had our agreement, and the rest has been history. So
cool. Mark, how did you come into it from your perspective on it?
Yeah. So from my perspective, I wasn't really involved in Bitcoin Cash in any serious way at all at the time, and this was sort of the first project I got into. And I'd only been sort of interested in Bitcoin Cash for 6 months by that time. I sort of was talking with Jonald one day, and he was like, "Oh, we're working on this token protocol, and I saw you're kind of interested in tokens, and would you like to help us out?" And so I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll help you guys out." And we just got hacking. I learned everything about tokens, like colored coins and Omni style tokens and everything. It just I gave myself a little crash course on all the tokens, and figured, okay, we should go with a colored coins type system and just try to make it as simple as possible. And that's SLP.
Perfect.
That's what it is.
Great. So that was in July of 2018. Chris, do you want to just carry on?
Yeah, sure. So it looks like then, am I right in understanding, James, that you then kind of forked Electron Cash and kind of got busy implementing the specification into this fork of Electron Cash?
yeah, exactly. As soon as Mark joined the team, we started developing the spec in some Google Doc, and probably the same day we created the first draft spec, we also forked Electron Cash, probably a month before the spec was published.
Okay, yeah. And just for people who are watching this and aren't familiar, I think the big difference between the SLP protocol and other types of token protocols is that it's not miner validated. And that's why this op group thing was kind of important in the history, is because if that had gotten accepted, it would have opened the door to miner validated tokens. which is advantageous in that the tokens use the same security model as Bitcoin Cash. Whereas, and then when that got rejected, the simple ledger protocol uses the op return, which is basically like a line of text, and then Electron Cash or SLPDB will follow the graph called a DAG, and will read these like chains of op return to figure out like who owns which token. So the validation takes place not in a full node, but in a separate piece of software. So I think that's one piece of information that often gets lost when people talk about tokens. That's probably important to point out there. So then I think at that point, I was at that kind of brings us around to that period, like August, September timeframe, when we were working I was working at Bitcoin.com at that time, and I was focused mostly on the wormhole protocol, which was a competing token protocol. And Drew had been focused more on the SLP. He was keeping tabs on that. And so we were kind of both, that was our two different fields of specialization. And so he can maybe speak a little bit more to what happened during this time period from August to basically the network upgrade in November when BSV split off.
Sure. So that was at the time when we did the launch for the token features, which was when we said that we were the first wallet to support both SLP and wormhole. Because for sure,
Right.
EC was the first to have SLP support to follow up on that earlier. And then around that fork time was actually a really critical time that showed the big difference between SLP and wormhole, and really the big advantage of SLP being that it didn't rely on keeping a full node updated, because SLP is just a lot simpler to work with. And so it was able to still continue operating without any big changes at all, whereas wormhole needed a ton of maintenance, and we had to make quite a few considerations to try to figure out which token we wanted to back. And there were many discussions about that, and we ended up deciding that we wanted to put most of our effort in SLP just because we would get so much more bang for the buck on that one. It just would require a lot less effort to go further.
Yeah, that's an important lesson that we learned about during that time was at the time, Wormhole was built on top of a full node. And so its release cadence corresponded with the 6-month network upgrade. And so what that means is if there's no one around to update the code base, then it automatically gets forked off the network. And so that was one of the architectural decisions that James and Drew and I and Gabriel made when we were talking about the creation of SLPDB was, let's not do that. Let's make the release cadence of SLPDB like decoupled, like it's an application that talks to a full node rather than combining them into one application to avoid this so that the release cadence could be decoupled from the full node schedule. So that's an important piece of history. Go ahead.
It's also interesting that just as a like weird historical note that during that fork time, Wormhole was like a huge point of contention upon which that BCH, like Craig Wright was going crazy and his crew were going crazy about how Wormhole was this huge problem, whereas the SLPDB had some big contributors to it. I mean, who are authors listed as authors of the original spec, who are now part of BSV. So it's kind of interesting that like it was just this weird, Wormhole was just this weird thing that caused all this kerfuffle and then went away, and like SLP was just left. It's kind of interesting that way.
I love that story. Like I love the story that I mean, SLP was basically put together by half the people in this meeting, and then a bunch of the rest of us like jumped on board. It was very bottom up and very like sort of ragtag cypherpunk rather than some of the other token protocols, which have been more top down and like and maybe like company backed. Oh, go ahead.
Hopefully we can get Jonald Fyookball on one of these future meetings, because he was like, you know, I think that without Jonald's support in getting SLP and the Electron Cash wallet and making SLP a light wallet compatible protocol, you know, I'm not sure if SLP would have been successful.
Yeah, he does have an ability to crack the whip, that's for sure.
I'll agree with that. Jonald is definitely very influential for a lot of Bitcoin Cash things, and especially SLP. He's just involved in it a ton and puts a lot of effort in.
For sure.
Yeah, the BSV split was November 15th, 2018. And that really changed things, because one thing that had nothing to do with BSV was, at the time, Wormhole, which was the other major competing implementation for tokens, was primarily funded by Bitmain. And they, you know, for whatever reason, that development stopped. And because the full node was on the same release cadence as the network upgrades, that got forked off the network. And I don't know, I think maybe it's still around. That's the nice thing about this technology, is it can always be resurrected if someone's willing to put in the work. I just don't really know what happened. It was at that point that you know, Drew and I were working for Bitcoin.com, so we had to make the tough decision to go all in on SLP, and that was originally why we supported both, is in case for that very scenario where one might not make it, because this is crypto and things like that happen. And so it ended up being a pretty prudent decision on our part. And then that's when Bitcoin.com partnered with Simple Ledger and James Cramer, and he forked BitDB and started creating SLPDB. Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about that, James? Like, what is SLPDB? What's the BitServe and BitSocket? And kind of how does that technology work for people who don't know?
Yeah, sure. So SLPDB is essentially a indexer for all information and data that's related to SLP. And it's a fork of BitDB, which does the same thing. It indexes all of the properties of the Bitcoin Cash blockchain. And then BitServe and BitSocket, those two BitServe provides an HTTP gateway to the BitDB, so you can make these sort of Mongo-like queries over HTTP endpoint and connect directly to the MongoDB database. And then BitSocket or SLP socket provides streaming data. So when an SLP transaction comes in, you'll get a notification through a socket. So that's sort of what those softwares do.
Cool. So then you started simpleledger.info and built a block explorer around that technology.
Right.
And
so yeah, just with queries directly to SLP serve and SLPDB on the back end, all of the information that you see on simpleledger.info is essentially pulled through these SLPDB queries.
Yeah, and that, for me, that's when things started to get really fun, because I remember when there was less than 100 tokens like in existence. And so we, on the rest.bitcoin.com side, we built API endpoints that could track some of these things, like the number of tokens in existence and information about them. And then you created the block explorer, which visualized a lot of that information. And so from day, I think now there's over 6,000 tokens, like classes of token. And so we were just like, every day we would just watch, like, oh, somebody made, like, there's been 10 tokens made in the last 24 hours. And that's when Spice Token really like took off. And that's when things started going like hockey stick. And our software started breaking down because it just was growing so fast. Like, that was our biggest thing. I remember just fighting fires with you because like I said, this was a bottom-up kind of approach, and and we were just trying to stay one step ahead of all the user activity.
Yeah. Well, just to clarify on the SLP or the simpleledger.info Explorer, that was actually built by JT Freeman, who unfortunately he couldn't make the call today, but he's been a huge contributor to SLP and sort of providing architectural decisions on how things should move forward. He has a ton of experience with infrastructure and stuff, and so that SLP Explorer is essentially his baby that he built, and I've just been there to help. I think I put up the initial bounty of 1 BCH to create that Explorer, and it's like you couldn't. It would have cost like 20 BCH if you wanted to pay somebody to build the product that we have today. So yeah, it's been a pretty cool. It's a really nice Explorer. So
then that's when Bitcoin.com released Badger Mobile, and Pete, who's behind that, couldn't be here. But Drew, maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience with both. I don't think you really talked a bit about the origin of Badger Wallet, like where it came from and how that started, the extension. And then maybe you can speak a little bit to the early days of the mobile wallet.
Okay, sure. So on the extension, that really came about from when James Cramer and I were working on ChainBet, which was around June and July of summer of 2018, which was about the same time that SLP was just coming up. And we were building these different apps, and we kept noticing that we keep having to build these wallets into these apps to do this custom work. And so we really wanted some sort of solution that websites could work with and use some other wallet so that we don't have to keep building wallets and integrating them into every app that everyone builds. So we wanted to solve that problem, and we also wanted to have an easier to work with wallet for tokens. And so that's kind of where we came up with the idea to do Badger. And we went back and forth a lot initially on if we should start fresh on a new extension or what is the closest other extension. And we ended up deciding that forking MetaMask would be the best decision for a phase one. And so that's what we did. And then we always kind of knew that we would need to do a rewrite because MetaMask is so geared towards Ethereum that we're really squeezing in these BCH properties, and it's really not designed to do that. So there's a lot of inefficiencies involved. And so the follow-up plan to that was that for Badger Mobile, which by the way, Spicy Pete works on that and he does an excellent job. He's the primary contributor on that project. And so our idea for the roadmap on that is he would design and build a shared data layer that would initially start with Badger Mobile, and then we would kind of port that over because it's in JavaScript and React Native as well. We would port that over to Badger extension. And so that's kind of where we're at now. Is he did Badger Mobile and we've got that and it's really nice. And then the next phase that we're looking at would be porting that over to the extension whenever we can find time.
So I think that kind of takes us into the period where Vin started to get interested in SLP. And I think was it the URI specification that caught your interest, Vin? Is that where it started?
Well, Jonald had actually given me a copy of the draft in late July. So I had been following it, but even at that time when he gave it to me, I was like, okay, there's some UX issues here. One of them was obviously what's recently come out with the postage protocol. But I also saw some issues in terms of it's so open and so flexible, and it does require, as we've already talked about, so much validation on the application side to be able to do this right. Like you get no support from the protocol level, basically, in terms of validating that. it was in April that Bitcoin.com reached out to me because I had been banging the BIP70 drum and had built servers for Cointext. So they reached out to me to build some servers, some BIP70 infrastructure for them, and built right into that, because it looks like that was like right at the time that you guys were doing the Badger stuff, is that they said, oh, and it's got to support SLP, which presented a entirely new situation, because BIP70, you can absolutely, just using the BIP70 protocol, send somebody a counterfeit SLP token and it'll be perfectly fine. So there's additional validation and additional checks that need to be done. There's issues with sending change back that doesn't work quite right with BIP70, because it's the op return changes, and so that changes some things in the template. So I guess it was probably around the beginning of June that I just went ahead and actually added that into the BIP70 server for Bitcoin.com and got it working, and then drafted up the spec for, I mean, I guess everybody calls it SLP BIP70, but it's technically BIP70 is its own specification, right? But good enough. I mean, it's a simple ledger payment protocol. And then Badger extension was the first wallet to put it in. Drew coded up, I think, about 95% of the code for both BIP70 and the SLP, the simple ledger payment protocol, and it was sitting in Badger extension, and it was basically done. I think all I did was come in and maybe uncomment about 400 lines, and then add in a little tiny bit, like maybe like 20 lines of code, and boom, it was working. And then Spicy Pete went, and I think it was probably about 2 months ago that he went and added it into Badger. So there's a production ready server at Bitcoin.com that just people aren't quite aware of that it exists. But anybody so the reference implementations for this in terms of the client is Badger, both of the Badgers. So anybody who wants to do a client implementation of this, reach out to me and I'll give you access to the servers so that you can test against Bitcoin.com's servers, which are the only ones that are up right now for that. Supports any token, so you can utilize any token. And I would love to see, I know that I just learned that there's a BIP70 server implementation inside of Electron Cash. And I guess the guy from BCH Coffee, I think it is, bchcoffee.org, went and wrote a blog post about how people can build that out. So if somebody wants to build out a server and add the SLP aspect into that, I think that would be an awesome project. Yeah, it's shop.bchcoffee.org/BIP70 is I had no idea. James, did you know that there's a BIP70 server inside Electron Cash? I had no idea. But there is one. So who knew? And it's not like a full web server on it and everything. It's really, really weird. I don't know who put that in there, but it's there. So that would be an awesome project for anybody who wanted to also add in the simple ledger payment protocol. Would be awesome as well.
So for people who are watching this and trying to get a grasp of the timeline, yeah, in my mind, it was prior to January 2018, a lot of this was just theoretical. There was just a handful of people working on the protocol. But then by this point, which is June, so the middle of 2018, things had started to hockey stick, and adoption was increasing very, very quickly. And then to bring in BIP70, and then that's also when we started, it became really apparent that we need non-fungible tokens, so that the NFTs. People who are watching this who aren't familiar with that, you can think of CryptoKitties on Ethereum, which is different than a token, where a token's like a cryptocurrency, but a non-fungible token is supposed to represent one unique thing, like a piece of artwork or an automobile, or like one thing, and it not to be interchanged with another automobile or another piece of art. And we started getting a lot of Bitcoin.com started getting, at least from my perspective, which is where I was at, started getting a lot of requests from like, yeah, these tokens are great, but we really need the NFTs for these different business ideas. And so by this point, we were working pretty closely with James Cramer to quickly draft specs and then bring them into implementation. I don't know, does anybody else want to speak to the whole NFT thing?
So this was July of 2019, this year, correct?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Or yeah, I'm sorry, 2019. Yeah, January. Yeah.
Time goes
Yeah.
fast when you're having fun. Go ahead, James.
The only comments I wanted to make was like, I remember when, everybody was sort of complaining that there was no NFT spec for SLP, and my standard response was, well, you just create a token with a quantity of 1, and the problem with that was there was no way to like group NFTs together. And, you could work something out where you put something in the token document, and then you could just say, well, anything with this specific string, they're going to be related, and but that wasn't good enough because it wasn't like there was no a DAG, so the whole thing with SLP is that everything can be validated through a DAG, and also light wallets can validate them on their own without having to scan the blockchain. So because of the light wallet requirement for NFTs and also trying to get them grouped together specifically, that was the reason why we created NFT1 was, so basically the way that works is you create a parent NFT, which is not really an NFT, it's just like a regular token, but it has a different token version number. And in order to create a child NFT, you just burn one of the parents. And so anytime you burn one of that parent token, you're creating a new child NFT, which is of the same group of the parent. So they're all linked together in the DAG, which pretty much solved the problem that everybody was asking for.
Yeah, and another one of the sort of repercussions of this architectural decision was that prior to the NFT spec, you could do NFTs, like you said, by just creating a token with just one token. But then if you wanted to have like multiple NFTs, like let's say in a video game, you wanted to have like a bunch of unique items, you'd have to, this came through like when you're trying to match like icons or graphics to a token, like in Badger Wallet, how some tokens have like a really cool piece of artwork that shows up next to the token. You'd have to do that for every single token, whereas with the NFT spec, you can submit one icon and that gets applied to all the child NFTs. And that's accurate, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's a huge benefit of NFT1.
Yeah. So then at this point, in order to scale, there were all these, you were adding features so quickly, James, to SLPDB at that point. And there were all these like little things that we kept saying like, man, I wish we could just isolate that one feature. So you started spinning off a whole bunch of JavaScript libraries like SLP list and SLP validate for different use cases where it's like, you really don't need a full-blown SLPDB. Really, all you need to do is validate the DAG, or all you need to do is like list the tokens. And then, yeah, go.
No, I was just agreeing. So yeah, it sounds good.
Yeah, and then let's see. There's at that point we got an audit got done on the Trail of Bits did an audit for us and that was both Electron Cash and SLPDB, right?
It was the validator. Well, Trail of Bits looked at the SLP specification for Token 1 and also NFT1. And then they also did security audit of the validators, the validator that's in Electron Cash, and then also the JavaScript validator, which is SLP validate NPM library.
Yeah. So so that was really valuable. Those audits are always valuable. And then, so the next in the timeline is the postage protocol. And my perspective here might be skewed because like it seemed like you came out of left field with that one, Vin. Was that the reality, or were you inspired by something, or how'd that all start?
No, I mean, it's funny because I went and looked back at because I wanted to see, oh, when did I first see this thing as you were putting this together? And I even shared in our little private Telegram. I went back and looked, and it was like July 21st. There's a text conversation between Jonald and I, and I'm like, yeah, man, I love this spec. Like, it looks really cool, but I just see this huge UX issue of if I send SLP tokens to somebody and they don't have any BCH in their wallet, like the tokens are stuck. And he's like, yeah, it's kind of like the ERC20, like it's the same situation if you don't have any gas, like for ETH. And so it's not at all that it came out of left field. Like I was like, from before this thing was even published, I was like, well, this is the problem to solve, right? Like this is the UX problem to solve.
Yeah, and you're talking about July 2018, right? You saw that back in 2018.
July 21st, 2018. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like
and the timeline we're talking about is in July 2019.
No, it was it was published what? The spec was published
November.
August 21st, 2018. So so literally a month before it was published, he gave me a draft, and this was my response. So it was one of the reasons why I wasn't even really all that excited about the token protocol, was because I just was like, well, there's ERC20s and they have this terrible gas problem. You know, like you can't use them in commerce because they've got this terrible gas problem. You just can't. And so then it was after building the payment protocol, the BIP70, and then that was like everything was in line to be like, okay, a server is accepting and validating a transaction. All the headers are in place, all the functionality is in place. And to do the postage protocol, one of the cool things that Bitcoin has that almost nobody uses are the various different SIG hash algorithms. So basically, like a lot of people don't know that you can use a flag called anyone can pay, and basically like send an incomplete transaction. Like I can send it to you, Chris, and then you can actually add your own input in. And then you could even send it to somebody else and they could add another input in. So it's kind of like, like splitting up a check or something. Like we could say, this is what we need to pay. I'll pay a little bit, you pay a little bit, you pay a little bit. Anyone can pay. I don't care who pays, just so long as they pay this thing. And so postage protocol, there's almost nothing that uses that in Bitcoin. But it's there. Like it just sits there, but almost no applications use it. And so this was an opportunity to use it, because it's like, well, this is the canonical thing. So it's like, I don't have the last little piece, but I'm able to pay you in whatever this token I have is, if you'll pay it. And so it leverages what was the protocol that was already there. And yeah, that's it. It wasn't at all that it was out of left field. It was like, I knew this was the problem to solve. And then this was just like the logical progression from everything that had been added in. So I'm glad that people like it, because I think solving this problem is going to make a huge difference in how people use SLP.
So that's a protocol. One of the things I got a little clarification on is this postage protocol as a protocol that rides. It's totally independent of BIP70, but it complements BIP70 in terms of riding on top of. If you already have BIP70 set up, this is just a very nice thing to add right on top of it, and then you can natively pay in tokens. Yeah,
you don't need to use it, but what it does, but it uses the same protocol buffer format for accepting the transaction back. So yeah, you totally don't need it at all. But because it uses basically the same one, integrating it into an existing BIP70 server is a super easy. So like when I integrated it so Cointext has a post office. So anybody who's building a client, if you need a server to test against, it's just, again, hit me up. Cointext has one, and Bitcoin.com will have one added into theirs very, very soon. So it if you've got a BIP70 server up, like it literally took me like an hour and a half to add in the postage. It's really, 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 really easy.
Great, thank you, Vin. Moving on to November, Chris.
Yeah, so this is when I'll let James speak to this really, but James, can you kind of give a background on the headache that was being caused by these giant DAGs, especially when Spice Token took off?
Yeah, sure. So the Electron Cash SLP wallet, one of the core principles is to self-validate the token DAG locally. So what we don't want to do is rely on some server to give us a response on whether or not a token is valid or not. Because if that server lies to us, you could end up having all the tokens burned. So self-validation locally is really important. And what started happening was, as some of these token DAGs got really large, like Spice, I think there was like, once we got to like 20,000 transactions with Spice, we started noticing some problems. Like it just would take too long to validate, and people were complaining about how long it took. So at that point, we started thinking about what solutions we could provide. And one of the things that we came up with was called something called graph search. And graph search essentially sped the validation process up. The way that it speeds the validation process up is it reduces the amount of network latency there is to go and grab transactions. So the Electron Cash wallet, when it's doing validation, it goes and grabs transactions individually. So each time it does that, there's some network latency. And that builds up over, the more transactions you need, the more latency you're going to experience. So what graph search does is you tell a server which token you're trying to validate, and then the server responds with the entire package of transactions that you need to validate that token. So instead of having maybe 5,000 network calls, you only have one network call, download the entire package of transactions at one time, and then you do the validation locally. So it was really interesting. Actually, we used MongoDB to implement graph search at first using Mongo's lookup graph query feature. And that actually worked really well. We had this crazy query that I couldn't even believe we came up with. But that was like in September. And once we hit like, 30,000 transactions, it was just clear that that wasn't going to work from a scaling standpoint. It was slowing down SLPDB, and Mongo database just couldn't handle those queries. It was just too complex. So JT Freeman was involved with that original implementation of graph search with me. And he was just like, oh, I know C++. We'll just re-implement this whole thing in a custom C++ server. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know he knew C++. So he spent like a month writing a graph search server from scratch. And one of the things that we wanted to do is totally decouple from SLPDB and just only rely on a full node. So in order to do that, he also had to implement a SLP validator in C++. So, we got two things out of that work. We got like the fastest possible validator that you can have because it's written in C++. And then also we got the graph search technology, which allows us to download a package of all the transactions you need to locally validate. So that just keeps SLP as this trustless validation process. And so then right around November 2019, he pretty much finished the initial version of that.
I'd like to add one thing on that real quickly on the scalability of the validate method. There was one point for the rest.bitcoin.com SLP/validate endpoints that we had an even much less scalable solution than some of these. And we worked a lot with James and Mark as well on coming up with this, and Chris as well. But at one point, we actually had like several hundred, 200 or 300 at one point, Electron Cash wallets, just hosted on a server on a Kubernetes cluster, trying to push throughput on validate for a very short period of time.
Yeah, we tried a lot of different things to try and stay ahead of the curve, and it was difficult.
Yeah, like you said earlier, we hit like a hockey stick of interest. And so we weren't prepared initially for so much, excitement about SLP. And I think finally at this point, we're starting to catch up with all the excitement and stuff. And now with the Bitcoin.com is building a Java validator. And then we also have the C++ validator. So we have the tools now to scale, far into the future. I think we'll be good for several years.
That's really good news. I always like to hear about scaling. Are we done with the timeline now, Chris? Or are we going to touch on a couple of other things?
Yeah, I think we're done with the timeline. I know you like to keep these to around an hour.
We have had some questions come in from Dream Trove, and that are directly related to the post office protocol. So if it's okay with you guys, I think we'll move on to the post office protocol adoption by wallets. And then Vin, if you have stuff to add here, maybe this would be a good time to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of post office protocol adoption by wallets, I have a fork of Badger that some people have probably seen in the demo, but that code is it needs to be cleaned up before it can be put in a pull request for Badger. But needless to say, it works pretty darn good. I mean, even as sort of stringy as it is right now. I know James had said that there was some work with Electron Cash putting it in. This person, I think they're asking about it says, so I was thinking that algorithmic self-stabilizing token could decrease supply with a token burn. So yeah, if the token were worth $1 USD, the fee would cost maybe 1 cent, but maybe you wanted to burn 1 cent to reduce excessive circulating supply, which might work if there was one gas station, but someone might circumvent it. Seems like potentially on-chain solution that might be better than having the burn as a wallet protocol. Or I'm not actually sure what this person is asking about, and I don't necessarily think that it really has too terribly much to do with the gas station. I mean, anybody with a token can burn it pretty easily. I mean, all you do is you just send it, get an invalid transaction mined, and you're basically done. You just burnt it. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to say about it, but I don't think that that's particularly a post office thing.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing it brings to my mind is just some of the interesting things that we can do with script and SLP. Because Bitcoin Cash has the opchecks data sig opcode, we can do these things called covenants, which means that we can require, if you have an SLP token, it can only be spent in a certain way. And so we're going to be using that tech in order to create these minting contracts, meaning that you could, a person who's holding a mint baton can only create so many tokens in a certain period of time, have like an emission schedule for tokens. You can also guarantee that the minting baton cannot be burned or destroyed. So, you could also use these covenant contracts to sort of, come up with some burning schedule as well, I would imagine.
Anything further on the protocol adoption by wallets, post office protocol?
Yeah, so I'm working on the Electron Cash client for the post office protocol. I'm thinking by Friday I should have a demo that people could use.
Look forward to that one for sure. Moving on then to smart contracts for minting and SLP decks. Who wants to tackle this?
I can't say too much about that because I'm not exactly involved in that stuff. But yeah, I wish I knew more. All I can say is what James is saying is that the covenants can do cool things, but nothing more specific than that.
So I know, James, you're working on a covenant that prevents the burning. It's sort of like a dummy-proof cementing baton that prevents people from being able to burn the minting baton accidentally. And then, so I'll let you speak to that. And then, real quick for dexes, I don't know if there's anything at the protocol level for dexes. One of the sites that's really impressive to me is memo.cash. They have sort of a one-sided dex where you can sell only, but it's still pretty effective. And I know that people in the community have had a lot of fun playing with it, and there might be others. So you know, it's a growing. This is all new tech. It's all for the most part less than a year old, and it's exciting to see the innovation that happens. But yeah, James, why don't you talk a little bit to your covenant for preventing burning of the minting baton?
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of it's a repeat of what I was just saying, but basically the original concern with the minting baton was it can possibly be burned if you don't have an SLP aware wallet. And that's just, you know, that's a unique thing about SLP is the wallet has to be aware of the SLP protocol. Otherwise tokens can be burned. But we can use smart contracts in order to prevent that. And the issue comes in when you have a seed for your wallet and that wallet's SLP aware, but then you take that same seed and you put it in some different wallet that's not aware of SLP. That's when you can have you know, bad things happen with accidental burning, and especially if you are operating like a stable coin, like the USD honest coin. You know, the last thing that you want to happen is that minting baton to be destroyed. So, you know, we can create a smart contract that essentially makes that impossible. And so that's something I've been working on with Carol, and also the idea of having a minting baton that anybody can spend, you know, let's say in monthly intervals, that minting baton could mint a specific amount of tokens. So you have like an emission schedule for minting a token, and that would just be controlled by a smart contract. So that's something also that we're looking at. There's a link to the repo in the timeline list that you provided.
Yeah, it's cool. That's totally possible. I can imagine how that works. That's probably the simplest example of a SLP smart contract, actually. Neat.
Okay, I'm going to add Tobias Ruck to the panel.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah, it's good. Tobias, welcome.
Welcome.
Hey, welcome.
Hi. So you talked about SLP decks, so I thought like, hey, why don't I just chime in for a second? So yeah, SLP decks currently is paused because we couldn't figure out a way to trustlessly place buy orders. We can't place buy orders. So if you want to say, okay, I want to buy 5,000 spice, then you would have to have someone offering 5,000 spice, but you can't say, okay, whomever wants to sell me those can accept them. This is the only reason is that we cannot trust inputs to be legit, like SLP inputs. They might be invalid.
Yeah.
So
I'd say this is a fairly like fundamental issue of that comes from the way it's this token protocol is permissionless. So I don't think there's any workaround for that.
So a possible workaround for that would be to make a more complicated smart contract, because we're like tomorrow is the script meeting, and it might be possible if we add some simple opcodes like the ones we're proposing, and maybe we need additional ones. I'm not sure, to enable like on-chain enforced smart contracts. Do you think it would be worthwhile to have a look at like to combine those two approaches, where like, okay, can we actually use smart contracts to enforce the token rules? Or would you rather be let's not overcomplicate this thing and reduce the possibilities?
Yeah, I don't think I think it's like theoretically impossible to do that, actually. It's kind of a long thing, so we probably shouldn't get into it, but yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, there's an interesting question there. But basically the problem boils down to the fact that, any Bitcoin transaction can take in valid SLP inputs. It can take in just regular BCH inputs, or it can take in invalid SLP inputs.
Yeah.
And how do you know? Well, the SLP rules say you should go back to the ancestors of all your inputs and look at those, and then go back to all those ancestors. And there's no hope of doing that in a smart contract that's only 520 bytes long to search a 1 million transaction history. So there are some ideas about doing like recursive proofs, but I don't think in practice they can work for some technical reasons. So, but you, as Tobias mentioned, you can do sell orders. And there's actually a very simple construction, which is you just make a partially signed transaction that says, oh, I've signed this transaction that gives away my SLP coins to whoever completes the transaction by sending me this amount of BCH that's already in the transaction. And anybody can fill in the rest of the transaction. And actually that works great. It's very simple. The other way is extremely hard, unfortunately.
Yeah, the way, just to like expand on that, the way SLPDEX handles this is that it allows that you can choose which amount of tokens you want to buy. So if I offer 5,000 SPICE tokens, then you can be like, okay, yeah, I only want to buy 2,000 of them, and the remaining 3,000 have to be sent back to the contract.
Right. Yeah, to make it partially filled order, then it has to be much more complex with all the covenants and everything. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds like there's some more for a follow-up call at another time. We'll go into that.
I will say real quick, David, there's a healthy discussion on the GitHub page that actually has the SLP specification. There's like there's an issues tab, and one of the issues that we have there is it's called V2, and we have a really healthy discussion there of like potential if we were to change the protocol in the future, like these are sort of like the wish list items that we'd like to consider. And so some of these things could be on that.
Do you want to move on to the bounty listings?
Yeah.
Go ahead, James.
Sure. If you go to, if anybody's interested in working on some SLP items, you can go to the slp.cash website. And now there's an item at the top called bounties. And on that page, there's a list of 6 bounties that are up right now for things that people can work on. For example, the first item is called smart contracts for SLP minting. And this gets back to this discussion we were having earlier. So if anybody's interested, you can go there and check out the various items.
Also on the topic of bounties, it's not like anything official, but we do have a small petty cash wallet, about 1 Bitcoin cash per month. It's like around $300 a month that the developer.bitcoin.com team, me and Drew, have at our disposal. It's not enough money to like seriously pay people. It's more of just like a recognition of work done when people do things and help us out. So it's less about payment and more about just acknowledgement.
Sounds good. Do you want to talk about the last few items on the looking forward list then, Chris?
Yeah, we already kind of, James already talked to Graph Search and the GS++ for scaling. Another big feature that has been sort of in the collective mind lately is sweeping being able to store SLP tokens on a paper wallet, on like a cold wallet. This was something that, one thing that we failed to put in the timeline was the SLP hackathon that JT hosted a few months ago.
Right.
Because that's where this idea, this desire to store tokens on a cold wallet, like really took shape. And one of the teams started working on templates for a paper wallet where you could store tokens. That's another thing, another call out to Spicy Pete. He's been working hard on that. I sort of created a proof of concept of taking a normal sweep. A sweep is when if you go to like paperwallet.bitcoin.com, you can generate a paper wallet. It has a public key and a private key, and you can put your send Bitcoin Cash to the public key, and then use like the bitcoin.com wallet app to sweep the private key and retrieve the Bitcoin Cash on that paper wallet. So this is the same idea we want to apply to SLP tokens, but because normal wallets can burn SLP tokens if they're not token aware, we have to be very careful with this. And so I created a proof of concept, and Pokes, who is in charge of Crescent Cash, I've been developing an API endpoint for him. He's been much more proactive than I have, so if you're watching this, Pokes, I apologize for being so slow on that. We're also working with Spicy Pete and Badger Wallet to add that to Badger Mobile, where you can scan a paper wallet, and we're putting the finishing touches on that. So that's going to be really exciting, because that'll enable a whole bunch of new use cases like voting and cold storage, and a bunch of other things.
Great.
And I already mentioned the V2 SLP specification wish list, if people want to join the conversation there for future protocol changes. And that's the list.
Great. We'll get some show notes set up so that we can have links for people to follow from this conversation today. Any other final comments before we wrap up? 3, 2, 1. I'd like to thank you all for being here today and for the first meeting. I think we'll probably see more regular meetings for the simple ledger protocol coming up in the new year. And I'd like to thank you all for being here and getting this important information out to the community. So thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and thank you, David.
Yep. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.